Hello, friends. This is George Pappas, attorney at law and former immigration judge. Today, I want to basically bring in part two of who a real American is. I discussed this previously in one of my earlier videos, but I felt that a part two was necessary because this administration believes that only white Anglo-Saxon people who fought in the American Revolution or in the American Civil War are entitled to a privileged position to lead this country and to create a false hierarchy of privilege and power based on that racist Anglo-Saxon principle. What JD Vance, one of the architects and spokespersons for this real American redefinition, and also Stephen Miller, the assistant chief of staff to President Trump, also has been advocating the so-called invasion and threatening of our Western civilization based upon these non-Anglo white immigrants. Tragically, even Mr. Rubio, Secretary of State Rubio, was propagating these falsehoods in a Munich speech just yesterday. So the entire administration is attempting to rewrite history, a complete false narrative, a complete disingenuous hierarchy of power. And it affects not only people who are seeking legal status in the United States as immigrants, but it also starts to carve out privileged places for people in this society who have what JD Vance refers to as dirt or soil in this country. So a little history lesson is in play here for both the administration and for those who are carving out a devoted belief into these racist narratives of who has the privilege and the right to lead this country. We know that two groups were exploited to build the United States: Native Indigenous Americans and Black African slaves. You can't erase those two facts. I don't care how many narratives you want to spin, but those two facts will never go away. And we're not here to make anybody feel guilty. We're here simply to talk about the truth. Because if you understand the truth, guess what? We will become a greater nation. If we build a nation on whitewashing or erasing our history, that's not going to make us a great nation. In fact, the dangers of whitewashing history are evident now. Anything that we can do to whitewash what the German Nazis did in the 1930s would remove the blueprint that this administration is using to carve out privileges of power in this country. So let's talk about the Native Americans, the indigenous population. They were the ones that suffered tremendously to help this country grow and expand. The papal bulls from the Vatican in the 1400s identified to the King of Spain and Portugal that wherever they traveled and they saw heathens, non-Christians, they could vanquish and conquer those people. They didn't even consider them human. And that's exactly what the church, the Vatican, did back in the 1400s. So you had these conquistadors and other so-called explorers who reached North America, and lo and behold, they discovered heathens in our hemisphere. And of course, they proceeded to begin the onslaught against the indigenous population from the 1400s to the present day. It hasn't stopped. So an international legal doctrine was created. It was called the International Doctrine of Discovery. And the European powers, the Portuguese, the English, the Spanish, and other powers, decided to carve out North America based upon this doctrine, which basically said, if I plant the flag here first and I so-called settle this land, the other European nations have to recognize my right. Of course, that doesn't include asking the indigenous population whether planting that flag usurps their sovereignty. We'll get into that later on. But these European fictions of legal doctrine, of legal ownership of land, permeates until this very day. It hasn't stopped. The doctrine of discovery is still the current law in the United States today. Here's how it continued to morph as we move forward through history. After the Americans defeated the English in the American Civil War, they basically adopted the doctrine of discovery into American law, into American jurisprudence. And there was a case in 1823 called Johnson v. McIntosh, which did just that. And magically, Chief Justice John Marshall the godfather of American jurisprudence, declared that Native people are only entitled to an occupancy interest in their land, even though they've been here for thousands of years before the English arrived. So now they were considered tenants in their own land, but because the Americans wanted to appear benevolent to Europeans, we gave them an occupancy interest. But of course, the rest of those lands, Americans declared as ours. By virtue of the doctrine of discovery, we own that land. Amazing how these legal fictions camouflage dispossession and genocide. And that's what happened in 1823. So Johnson v. McIntosh provided the legal basis to dispossessing Native Americans of their ancient lands. And that progressed through other cases. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia back in 1831, which basically said that Native Americans didn't have the right to sue the state of Georgia for encroaching upon their land. Remember, Georgia was imposing their laws on the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation, the one that signed treaties with the U.S. government, the Treaty of Hopewell and others in the early 19th century, despite the fact that they were a foreign nation, which gave them jurisdiction to go straight to the Supreme Court if there was a controversy with any U.S. state. Chief Justice John Marshall said, well, you're really a domestic dependent nation. You're not really a foreign nation, so you don't have the right, or as he called it, standing to sue Georgia. So we're going to dismiss this claim. So overnight, Chief Justice Marshall classified our Native Americans as domestic dependent, as if the Native Americans were dependent upon the U.S. government to exist. But that's the fiction that was created. And then finally, there was another case called Worcester v. versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court, through John Marshall, actually said that Cherokee law and sovereignty trumps what Georgia was trying to do. It sounded like he was backpedaling. But in fact, what happened, Marshall retained sovereignty and ownership of land through the federal government. So at least with respect to the states, the U.S. Supreme Court said the Cherokee Nation and other sovereign indigenous nations trump state law. Remember that. What's happening here is that the doctrine of discovery underpins all of this. The doctrine says if you're a heathen and we discover the land, you don't own it. The land is terra nullius, as if no humans exist. Well, fast forward, that laid and opened the gates for the following. It laid the gates for manifest destiny, as if the Americans had this God-given destiny to move west, notwithstanding that they were dispossessing and killing Native American people along the way, on and on and on. In fact, the legal genocide sponsored by the government, you can see in California, thousands of Native people were slaughtered as game. And they were rewarded for doing this. Private posses roamed the land and killed indigenous people. Washington reimbursed the state of California to kill those people. This was in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. Wow, it was pretty sordid. What I'm doing here is telling folks that this history cannot be whitewashed. It existed. When we took children away from Native families, in the 20th century especially, we don't consider that racial genocide in our history books, but that's what we did. When you see children being separated at the border, that's not new in American history. It's not new. We dispossessed and took children away from their families by the score, the thousands and thousands from Native tribes in the West Coast. We brought them to the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. So we've been destroying Native American culture from the time that our existence started in this continent. JD Vance, Steve Miller, Marco Rubio have completely whitewashed our history. To go to Europe and say that their civilization and ours are tied together, and we can't let these non-Europeans and non-so-called Americans undermine Western civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, Western civilization committed genocide against our own indigenous people. That is the kind of Western civilization they are defending and whitewashing. And no, Mr. Vance, and no, Mr. Miller, and no, Mr. Marco Rubio, there is not a hierarchy here of who a real American is. Our nationhood is not defined by who we were, but who we become. The United States is a work in progress. It is constantly evolving. Heritage alone does not define who we are as a nation. And be careful using Western civilization as a dog whistle for white supremacy. It's not going to work. Our country was built on Native American genocide and black slavery. The sooner we acknowledge that history, the stronger we will become, the more united we'll become. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.